interview with Carson, who's been a lifelong aviator in Linn County. We do want to do an interview on your life, Carl, but first we would like to do one on your father, Willard Carson, more or less as a memorial to him. Okay. So if you could tell us when your dad was born and where he was born and little of his life, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, my father, Willard I. Carson, was born near Troy Mills, Iowa, about 30 miles north of Cedar Rapids, and his family had lived there for a couple of generations prior to him. He was born in 1909, and he and my mother were married in 1929. Her name was Christine Schonberg Carson, and she was also a native of that area. So they lived on a farm after they were married. They both grew up on farms, and after they were married, the Depression hit, and like so many people, they went broke on the farm. And they were living at that time on the farm about a mile and a half south of Troy Mills, and when they went broke, they moved into town. Excuse me. And my father started a feed business. Actually, he started out buying milk and eggs and cream and hides and chickens and anything that he could do to make a living during the period of time, 1931, 32, 33, 34. And so eventually it more evolved into a produce and feed business. And I was born in Troy Mills in 1934, right in town. I was not born in a hospital. And ironically enough, the building I was born in, my brother later owned, and that was kind of a nostalgic thing. But my parents then had a good business, made a living for us, my brother and I, and my mother and father. And in the late 1930s, mid-1930s to late 1930s, my father would come to Cedar Rapids frequently with his truck to get feed from some of the wholesale feed dealers here in Cedar Rapids. And in the process of coming to Cedar Rapids, the route that he took was a rock road that comes down what is now C Avenue Northeast in Cedar Rapids. And at that time, there was an airport at the intersection of what is now Collins Road and C Avenue, on the northwest corner of that intersection where Collins Radio Rockwell currently has a large plant. But on that location there was an airport, and it was called Saxon Airport, S-A-X-O-N. Ted and Grace Saxon were the operators of that little airport, and I guess the more my dad came by that place once or twice or sometimes 3 or 4 times a week, I think he started looking at those airplanes as he was driving by, and he had an airplane ride with a friend of his up at Troy Mills who had an airplane, and he had that first ride in about 1934 to 1935. And he was always one to enjoy adventures. He was a person who was very mechanically inclined, built lots of things that were mobile, ice boats and rebuilt cars and did things like that. He was a good mechanic.
Way ahead of his time.
Yeah, I think so. But he enjoyed that, and he was a bit of a daredevil. Not that he was unsafe, but in that era, people who built ice boats and watercraft and would fly in an airplane, that was, we're only talking 7-8 years after Lindbergh made his flight, across the Atlantic. So sometime in about 1937, my dad bit the bullet, and he stopped at the airport, got acquainted with Ted Saxon, who was also the instructor there, and started taking flying lessons. Ted had a dealership for Taylor Craft airplanes. Taylor Crafts were built in Alliance, Ohio. Mr. Taylor and Mr. Piper were originally partners, and they had a parting of the ways, and Mr. Piper went his way, and Mr. Taylor developed his own two-place side-by-side airplane, and the Piper Cub at that time, which was the only airplane that the Taylor Piper made together, was a two-place tandem seating arrangement. Well, so Ted had a 37 Taylorcraft there that my dad started flying in. That was a 40 horsepower Continental powered engine, single ignition, barely enough power to get my dad and the instructor off the ground, but it did. I don't know exactly how much my dad paid for flying lessons. I only know that he's, in later years, when people were learning to fly at his little airport, that he made the comment once that the instruction that people are getting today cost less than what he was paying in 1937 and 38, because money was tight then, and if you were paying $10 to $15 an hour in 37 or 38, that was pretty big money. And because I know there were times when my dad might not have made that much in a whole week, you know, in terms of net profit in his business. So,
what did his wife think of this?
my mother was a saint. Anything that my dad wanted to do, she kind of went along with. It was like anytime, you know, being out dealing with farmers, and he liked to talk. Anytime he came home from work, it didn't matter if it was 6 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night, it seemed like there was always a hot meal on the table, you know. So she went along with that, and in later years got a lot of enjoyment. She never had an interest in learning to fly herself, but she rode with them everywhere they went. Well, it took about a year and a half, year and three-quarter for my dad to actually get his license, because he couldn't fly every week. He didn't have the money to do that. So he finally got his license in 1939, and and by that time had joined a flying club. They had several airplanes at the airport, and they kind of had a club, and several people owned an airplane together. He felt, after he got his license, that it would be better if he owned his own airplane, because when you were in a club, you never know sometimes about the maintenance of the aircrafts and who flew it last, and, you know, sort of thing. So 1940, you know what happened, 1941, the war. So during those early war years, he did not buy an airplane. He was still flying in the club, and he was a member of the Civil Air Patrol in those days, which had been formed just a week before Pearl Harbor was bombed. And they had an active Civil Air Patrol squadron in the Cedar Rapids, a couple of them actually, in the Cedar Rapids, Marion area. And he was active in that. And then in 1943, there's a publication called Trade-A-Plane, which still is in existence, that lists airplanes all over the country for sale. And he was an avid reader of that, because he always had the dream of owning his own airplane. He saw an ad in there for a Taylorcraft, actually two of them, that was for sale in Meridian, Connecticut. So he called the owner and said yes, he had these two aircraft that had been used in 1940 and 41 for pilot training on the East Coast. Well, then as the war progressed, civilian flying was curtailed on both coasts pretty much, because of concern of the Germans on the East Coast, the Japanese on the West Coast. And so these airplanes were in storage. They were not being used. So he had another friend that he had learned to fly with out at Saxon that was interested also in an airplane. And the two planes were both Taylorcrafts. One was a 1940 model and one was a 1941. So my dad and this other person by the name of Ralph Edwards, I know his last name was Edwards, I think it was Ralph, took a train out to Long Island, and then somehow from Long Island got up to Meridian, Connecticut, probably with another train or a bus or something, looked at the airplanes, and they bought them both. My dad bought the 1940 model, and Mr. Edwards bought the 1941 model. The reason my dad bought the 40 instead of the 41 was because it was $100 less. And he paid $1,800 for it. Mr. Edwards paid $1,900 for the 1941 model. So they bought him in Meridian, Connecticut, and flew him back to Saxon Airport. And I have his original logbook that talks about the flight, and I heard him tell stories various times of that flight back from Connecticut. Coming through the mountains in Pennsylvania, snowstorms, forced landings, finding a place to sleep at night, finding gas, and it took them about 3 days of flying to get home. Now, they didn't fly all day, every day, but I don't know what the distance would be, but it'd probably be 1,200 miles, I'm guessing, something like that. And in 3 days' time, 400 miles a day, and these airplanes only cruised at about 90, 95 miles an hour. So they had an eventful trip.
Would they have had navigational maps at that time?
They had charts. But of course, there were no radios in those days, so it was strictly pilotage. You look at the chart, see where you're going, draw a line, look for checkpoints along the way, and then, of course, keep track of each other too, because they wanted to stay together so they could be together at night and that sort of thing. So he finally got home and landed at Saxon Airport. And so this was in the fall of 1943. He kept his airplane then at Saxon's that winter, and Saxon's had a very large hangar where they would just put lots of airplanes in, and in order to save storage space, they would push the airplanes in, engine first, and then they would tip the airplane up and set the propeller on a 5-gallon bucket and the tail sticking way up in the air, and that way they could just stack them in like dominoes. And if one of them fell, they would all be going down. But they didn't. They would just counterbalance and just a little overbalance, so the CG would keep the tail up and the engine down.
Was your dad able to do his own maintenance on the planes, or did he hire this done?
Both. The rules are that there are certain things that the owner-pilot can do, then certain things that you have to have done by a licensed mechanic. And he did a lot of his own work, but it was always under the watchful eye of a licensed mechanic, who then would sign off on the maintenance and that it was done correctly and it was approved.
Did your dad have to serve in the military?
No. He was, like I said, he was born in 1909, so in 1941 he was 32, which was just at the upper age limit, and so with a somewhat critical business, providing feed for farmers, and they needed to provide food for the war effort and for everyone. He was classified in a category that was not 1A, so that he did not have to serve, which kind of bothered him because he was very patriotic, and everybody from our little town, where only a couple hundred people lived in Troy Mills, everybody knew, and it was very patriotic thing to do, to serve. So what he did in lieu of that is that he would go out to factories and pick up new aircraft that the Army was buying for training aircraft, and he would fly them then out to different air bases. But he did that as a civilian. And he didn't do it frequently, but he did it on occasion. I know he flew up to South Dakota one time, and I don't know where else, but he would fly these airplanes.
He was doing his duty during
Right.
the war effort.
And then another thing that he volunteered to do but didn't do, and I've never read anything about this. There probably is some documentation to this, but probably it was in about 1944, I'm guessing, near the tail end of the war. The Post Office Department had instituted a program where they were recruiting civilian pilots to fly airmail. So he volunteered to do that. And I remember the trauma that was going on in our house because he did that without consulting my mother. But he came home one day and announced that he was going to become working for the post office, using his airplane to fly mail in areas just in the Midwest. And he had a date that he was supposed to report. It was in about 3 or 4 weeks, and just coincidentally, about that time, he got reclassified by the draft board into status of 1A, which was the highest category in terms of the potential for the draft. So he notified the post office department that he had gotten classified 1A, and that classification took precedence over what he was going to do in flying the mail. So consequently, he never flew the mail, and he never got drafted. So he just stayed at home, and he was the chairperson of bond drives. He was a chairperson of scrap metal drives, if you ever heard of those, during World War II. And we have photographs of old cars and machinery and things. We used the ball diamond outfield for a storage area, and we just had a tremendous response to that. And like all of us who are in that age bracket, we remember saving toothpaste tubes that were made out of aluminum at that time, and going out in the fall and collecting milk pods. Milkweed pods for life preservers and that sort of thing. So the whole era during that period of time that I was growing up and being involved, and my memory of that period of time was while the war was obviously something that nobody wanted, the response and the commitment to the war effort was totally positive. Yeah.
How long was, what year did Saxon go out of business, the airport?
Okay. I don't know the exact years, but there's a chronology here we need to follow. From the original location of Saxon that we talked about just a few moments ago, in the early part of the war years, and in about 1942, Ted Saxon had applied for a contract with the government to train pilots for the military, and that was under a program called Civilian Pilot Training and CPT program, and he was given a provisional approval to do that, except they had asked him to move his airport because it was too close to the congested area of Cedar Rapids. So then he moved his airport straight north on what is now C Avenue, about 2 miles, and it was on the west side of C Avenue, directly across from where McBride Airport is currently located. And they had a nice half-mile east-west, actually a little longer than a half-mile, about a 3,200-foot east-west runway and a 2,600-foot north-south runway. And so my dad, and that happened in 42, I think it was, and when my dad brought his airplane back from Connecticut, that's where they were located at that time. And we have some pictures, and in the exhibit that you'll see at the History Center, there are some photographs of the original Saxon Airport. At this point, I don't personally have any pictures of Saxon Field when it moved across from where McBride is now.
Was McBride Airport there at that time?
No, McBride did not get started until the early 60s. Yeah. So, and my dad kept his airplane then at Saxon's when he brought it home in 43, and in 1944 he bought some land 3 miles northwest of Troy Mills because he just felt he wanted to keep the airplane closer to home. It was much more convenient, and just the pride of having it there and having his own place. So he bought 17 acres, which was basically a 1,700-foot north-south runway, and he built a hangar and then moved his Taylorcraft up there. That was in 44, paid $100 an acre for the land, and paid for it in 2 years' time just selling hay off of the. He kept a runway down the middle and raised hay on the side and paid for it just selling hay. But built the hangar, and then when the war was over, there was a great deal of interest in private aviation. The aviation companies were promoting and advertising an airplane in every garage, just like a car in every garage practically. And in 1946, the airplane manufacturers across the country turned out thousands, literally tens of thousands of airplanes. And not everybody bought like they thought. And so a lot of companies folded too. But during that time after the war, my dad used to give rides on Sundays up at his airport. And I sold tickets. And it was $2. I think later it went to $3 for a 15-minute ride from his airport, 3 miles down, circle Troy Mills, come back and land. And his airplane had a 12-gallon gas tanks and burns about 4 gallons an hour. And I saw him sit in that airplane Sunday after Sunday till he had to fill the gas tank. And myself or my brother would go out and fill the gas tank while he ran to the bathroom and he'd get back in the airplane. We had sometimes 20, 30 people waiting in line for airplane rides. It was an amazing amount of interest at that period of time. He built a hangar, and pretty soon a friend of his bought an airplane and wanted to keep it there, so he built another hangar, and it wasn't long before he had room for about 6 airplanes there. And they were all just people who were flying for recreational purposes, no commercial uses out of it. He had a friend here in Cedar Rapids that had learned to fly at Saxon Airport who lived in Marion. His name was Clarence McGowan. They called him Mac McGowan. And he used to come up there on Sundays and give lessons. And my brother was in that age group. He was 4 years older than I. And he learned to fly there and got his license there. And then 2 of my dad's brothers, Ernie and Ralph, learned to fly, and they each bought airplanes. And both of their wives learned to fly and soloed from there, and one of their daughters. So, plus other people around town, you know. So there was, it was a pretty active little airport.
Was your mother, did she go flying with your dad?
She would go anytime he said, let's go someplace, she was ready to go. But this is a picture of Mom and Dad's little airport there, 3 miles northwest of Troy. And we still lived in Troy Mills when all this was going on, and he still was operating the feed business. But in later years, here's another picture of Mom and Dad. This is their Air Coupe airplane. This is not the Taylorcraft. My dad had 2 airplanes at the same time, and my brother would fly the Taylorcraft and my dad would fly the other, and the 4 of us could go places that way. But we were talking about my mom, and yeah, she would go anytime.
Did she ever get a license?
No, she was never ever interested in learning to fly. I don't think she probably even put her hands on the control wheel. But she was willing to ride, but had no interest in, I mean, she didn't even drive a car, so, you know.
Sometimes for safety's sake, the spouse will want to at least know how to run the controls, but she had no interest.
She had no interest, and, no, so.
Your dad, after losing everything in the Depression, he must have did quite well for himself in order to accomplish this flying education and buying planes and starting airstrips. He must have...
The feed business was good for them. Farmers and people who were involved in that sort of industry during the war, that was a profitable time. That's terrible to say, but during that war at least, people who weren't fighting, who were not in the military and were staying home in those critical occupations, they made money. Yeah.
And talking to you earlier, you used to mention gathering, pilots would gather at your place for fly-ins or something like that?
A very popular thing, even back in the old Saxon days. I have pictures in a scrapbook of flight breakfast in the 1930s at the old Saxon airport. And flight breakfasts were a very popular thing to do, usually on Sunday mornings. And the sponsoring organization would get together and plan bacon and eggs and that sort of thing, and they would advertise. And people would come from all over. Here's a picture of Ted Saxon, which may or may not show up very well, but this is a picture of Ted, the operator of Saxon Airport, with John Livingston. John Livingston and his brother Bite were from Waterloo area. John Livingston was a famous racing pilot during the 1930s, and the author Richard Bach wrote the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and the inspiration for the title of that book came from John Livingston from Waterloo, Iowa. And at the terminal building at the Waterloo Airport, there's a very nice display of the Livingstons in the terminal in Waterloo. And here's another picture of airplanes at the old Saxon Airport that had flown in for a flight breakfast one Sunday morning.
Was that right up in the corner of C and Blair's Ferry?
Yes. The east-west landing strip of that original Saxon Airport, the planes would come in right over where the pond is now. The pond is now on the east side of C Avenue, but at that time it was on the west side of C Avenue. I don't know how the pond moved across C Avenue, but it did. Here's Ted and Grace Saxon. One of the things that they often did for their breakfast, they would dress up in older clothes, even older than the 39. This is probably back in the 1920s or something, but that's Ted and Grace Saxon at one of their flight breakfasts.
Did your dad ever mention Hunter Airport, flying in and out of Hunter Airport?
Yes. In fact, I flew in and out of Hunter with him on many occasions. It was sort of there was a competition between Saxon and Hunter. And Hunter was better known probably because it was kind of associated with Cedar Rapids. Saxon Airport, really, it had a Marion address at that time, and it was considered the Marion Airport. And but during those 30s and 40s, when people were learning to fly, and then of course after the war, they were both very, very active. But there was competition between the two. And my father had many friends who flew out of Hunter, and we would go down there oftentimes. One of Dad's very good friends was a mechanic by the name of Charlie Sheets, and he was a mechanic at the Hunter Airport. And so oftentimes when my dad would take a plane in for an annual inspection or something, he'd have Charlie do that.
Is the Carson Airport still in Troy Mills, or is it kind of reverted back to farmland?
My parents built a new house out there in 1973, and they lived on the land then. Well, actually, they had lived there in a mobile home from the mid-60s till 73, and then they built a new house in 73, and my mother died in 1976. My dad continued to live on the airport land, and he died in 1994, and he still lived on the airport at that time. By that time, I had acquired his Taylorcraft airplane, and I brought it to Cedar Rapids, and he had quit flying when he was about 75, somewhere in that range. And he was 84 when he died. But he was always had been in good health, had no trouble in his 70s passing his flight physical. Ironically, he always had a big garden, and it was on the west side of the runway, and he was overlooking at his garden one day and walking back across and had a heart attack in the middle of the runway, and then died about a week later. But I thought that was always kind of an appropriate thing for him to do, probably to have that right in the middle of the runway. Yeah. But now, and then after his death, we sold the land, and it has now become a horse farm, and all the hangars are being used for horse barns and stuff. And the young couple that live there are wonderful, and
Do they know the history behind that?
yes. And my brother still lives in Troy Mills, and of course I have Dad's old Taylorcraft, and so I fly up there and fly over the old airport anytime I'm in that area, and if the owners are out there, I just make a low pass, coming right down where the runway used to be, and they always wave, and you know we have a good time with it.
Was your brother older or younger?
He was 4 years older.
4 years older. Did he have the interest that your dad had in flying?
He got his license when he soloed when he was 16, got his license when he was 17, which is as early as you can do it. And then he flew for maybe 10 years after that. But then he got married and had other responsibilities, and then he did not continue with it. But I take him with me once in a while when we went down to Davenport a year or so ago and had lunch, and But he was a good pilot, and I remember after he got his license, I was the first person to go up with him after he got his license, and we went up and did a spin. I remember that. But yeah, and he would go to a lot of flight breakfasts, and he got his license when, I'm guessing it was probably about 1946. And he would go to a flight breakfast with our family, and he would, at that time they had contests. They would give trophies or a cash gift or some prize to the youngest pilot, and he kind of cleaned up on that. Every place he'd go, he was always the youngest pilot. So.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Carl. I'm sure if your dad's listening, he'd be very proud of all the memories you had of him. Thank you for donating this to the History Center.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Let's take a break. Well, Carl, now that we know about your father, let's hear a little bit about your history. I normally ask everybody what inspired you to want to fly. I guess that's kind of a useless question in this situation, because you probably flew with your father as that little boy.
Yeah, I don't know the exact date, and I do like to know specific dates, but I don't know this of when I had my first airplane ride. But my father got his license in the summer of 1939, so I'm assuming it was probably in June or July of 1939 after he got his license, and I was 5 years old at the time. So.
Before we get started, what year were you born in, and were you born in Troy Mills, or?
Yes, I was born in 1934 after my parents had moved to Troy Mills and started the feed business, and they had an office there right on Main Street in Troy, and we had living quarters behind the office, and I was actually born in the living quarters there.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
My brother, Gene, who is 4 years older than I am.
Okay.
Yeah. So that, in 39, from the time my dad started flying, I just grew up with it. And so that was my inspiration.
You had no fear of flying with your dad, or?
No. He, one of the things that I admire about him, in all the years and all the hours that he flew, he never put a scratch on an airplane, and he was always proud of that. So.
Who did you take your training from? Your dad?
Well, yes. Informally, I would credit my dad with teaching me to fly, although he was not a licensed instructor. So. I did a lot of flying with him as I was growing up. We would go places, and he would just turn the controls over to me, and I would fly it. But the actual learning the maneuvers and all the intricacies of what's involved in getting your license, I did go through a licensed instructor. My first, my logbook entry in my original logbook dates to 1949. And that's when I was 15 years old, still in high school, of course. And I started taking lessons then. And I took several lessons. My first one was with a instructor up at Manchester, at the old Manchester Airport, by the name of Paul Boat. And then Merle Terry from Waterloo, I had some dual from him. But I admire my brother for sticking with it and getting his license when he was, or soloing when he was 16, getting his license when he was 17. I didn't do that. I guess other things interfered, got in the way, my interest wasn't there, whatever. Because after a few lessons, I really didn't do any more flying. I flew with my dad, but I was involved in activities in school and, you know, just never stuck with it. I actually did not solo until after I was married and had children. I soloed in 1963 in the Taylorcraft up at Dad's airport. My instructor was Carl Blair, who was a chiropractor here in Cedar Rapids. But then, again, didn't finish my license. Money, my wife and I were both teaching, and we just didn't have the spare money to stay with it to continue on to get my license. And so it was not until 1968 that I finished up my license and got my private license.
Did you, at that time in 1968, were you doing your flying out of your dad's airport or Saxon or?
Saxon's was closed by that time.
Was closed.
McBride was open. So what would happen, Dad would fly the Taylorcraft down to McBride Airport, and the person who was running the airport there was an instructor, and so I would fly with him in the Taylorcraft. But then as we progressed, and the rules had changed over the years, and the requirements for a private pilot's license required some radio work and that sort of thing. And of course the Taylorcraft did not have any electrical system, so it did not have radios. So I had to use their airplanes, and actually got my private license in a Piper Tripacer. Did
your wife share this flying hobby? I suppose you would call it a hobby at that time.
Yes.
Did she share it with you, or?
Well, she was supportive. She knew how much it meant to me, and once we were at a stage in our life where we could afford to do it, she was supportive of me going ahead and getting the license, and still is, and is willing to go and ride. And we have 3 children, and they took many trips in the back of airplanes, and but my wife never had an interest in learning to fly, and none of our 3 children fly either. They're willing to ride, but kind of an interesting story. Each of them, as they reached about 16 years of age, I gave them all a blank logbook and said, anytime you want to start filling this out, let me know, and I'll pay for it. None of them ever did.
You mentioned the fact that you first flew when you was 5 years old. Do you remember being scared at that time, or did you want to go up with your dad, or did he have to talk you into it?
I never remember being scared. Never do. I remember getting sick sometimes, but I never got scared. But no, I had all the confidence in the world of Dad. I think it's just as you're growing up, you have that feeling that you know, that you have that protectiveness.
It must be all right because Dad's doing it.
Sure, yeah. And Mom and Dad and I used to fly, and my brother did this too. While the Taylorcraft was a 2-place airplane, when we were smaller, we could get 3 of us in there and sit on a lap or squeeze between them or something.
Okay.
So in 1968, then when I got my license, I joined a flying club, a local flying club that was based out of Municipal Airport, and it was called Cloud 9. And at that time we had 3 airplanes, then we had 4, then we had 5. And we tried to keep a ratio of about 1 airplane for every 10 members. And the club was growing, and so we had nearly 50 members. We had 5 airplanes, and we had a variety. We had 2-place, 4-place, retractable gear. We had a aerobatic airplane, a Citabria, 2 Cessna 172s, a Cessna 150, and so it was a good club to be in. And it's still in existence. In fact, just a couple of days ago, one of the members that was in at that time, I saw him and asked him if he was still in that club, and he is, and they just have an Arrow now. They're just down to 10 members, one airplane. And that's kind of, I think, the history of aviation. Started slow in the 20s and 30s. During the war years, a great deal of interest. Post-war, a great deal of interest. And then in 47, 48, things really tapered down. Through the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of aviation kind of going again, a lot of people learning to fly. And now it seems like if you go to the airport, you see people your own age that you've known for the last 30 or 40 years, but you don't, there's not a great surge of younger people flying. Probably the best thing that's happened is the growth of the Experimental Aircraft Association, and there's a lot of people building their own. Very active EAA Chapter 33 here in Cedar Rapids that has a lot of activity, a lot of guys and women building their own airplanes, and a lot of them are Rockwell Collins people, engineers, aeronautical background, working on radios, whatever. But there's that group of people, but the general population, not just in Cedar Rapids but across the country, in my opinion, are not real enamored with private flying. We all fly airlines and stuff to go places, but the crunch of the private individuals learning to fly, while it's significant, is not like it was in the post-war years.
Maybe the younger generation is so exposed to so many other things anymore that aviation kind of doesn't appeal to them like it did your age group back then, when there wasn't nearly the things to do.
I think that's true. There's a lot of competing activities for disposable income as well as time. So that certainly, I'm sure, is a factor. After, in 1976, my mother died, and my dad had 2 airplanes at the time. He had the Air Coupe and the Taylorcraft, and I had flown both of those aircraft. And as he was into his late 50s, 60s, 70s, he preferred the Air Coupe. It was a low-wing, tricycle gear, faster aircraft, had a radio gear, self-starter and everything. And so he flew the Air Coupe most of the time. And after Mom died, then he approached me one day of whether I wanted the Taylorcraft. And I said, yeah, I would be interested in it. And he didn't give it to me. He sold it to me for $2,500. And I didn't even have $2,500, but my wife and I made an arrangement with him where we would pay him off over 3 years or something like that. So then I kept it at his strip in Troy Mills, which again, we were living in Cedar Rapids, my wife and I both teaching here, and it wasn't always that convenient to just go out and fly for a few minutes, to have to drive, get the airplane out of the hangar, and all that's involved in driving 30, 40 minutes to his airport. So I brought it to Cedar Rapids, actually to Marion, and kept it out at the Marion airport and had a hangar out there. And flew that for a number of years. And then in the mid-1980s, it was in need of some repair and rebuilding and so on. So I sold the airplane. And the person I sold it to became terminally ill, and he was not able to do anything with it, so he sold it to another person, and that person then recovered it, and shortly after he recovered it, he sold the airplane to a man who lived in Lone Tree. And I had always kept track of the airplane and where it was, and when the fellow in Lone Tree bought it, a man by the name of Ed Eden, I saw him. He was keeping it at Greencastle Airport, which is about 4 miles west of North Liberty. I saw him down there one day, and I said, well, if you ever decide to sell that airplane, let me know. And within a couple of years, he called me and he said he'd bought a four-place airplane and he was going to sell the Taylorcraft. So my wife and I talked it over and we decided that we should buy it back because we, it had so much history with our family. So we bought it back, and a partner and I, Dave Yeoman, who works at Rockwell, he and I bought it together and brought it back and found a hangar for it out at McBride Airport. And then Dave was my partner in that airplane for 3 years or so, and then he bought his own airplane and keeps it out at his dad's strip. His dad, Dave Yeoman, a senior, has a strip out north of Cedar Rapids. And so then I was looking, Dave, of course, was looking for a partner to buy his share, and another Rockwell person, John Giordano, bought his share, and then John and I enjoyed a partnership for a little over 2 years until about a year ago in May of 1990, or May of 2000. He was killed in an accident in Hawaii. So his widow still has half of the airplane, and we're looking for a partner for that half of it now.
If you did the proper maintenance on a plane, you'll have to. If you had a quality airplane and you did the maintenance on it on a regular basis when everything was supposed to be performed, what kind of life could you expect out of an airplane in regards to, what would you say, flying hours?
Indefinitely, really. There are airplanes flying that were built in 1918. There are lots of airplanes that are flying that were built in the 20s and the 30s. My airplane was built in December of 1940. The requirements are that the airplane has to be inspected and gone over by a mechanic annually. And so, they're looking at critical components to make sure nothing is deteriorated or makes the aircraft unairworthy. But if a person maintains the aircraft, mine is fabric covered. Most of them are metal now, or some sort of composite construction. But you take the fabric off, check the tubing, make sure the rust is not prevalent and that sort of thing. Do the engine maintenance, just if you keep them up the way you should, while it may require some rebuilding on occasion, there's nothing to say that the aircraft couldn't fly forever, really.
What type of maintenance could you, as an owner, do yourself, and how often did you have to do it?
The regulations are that there are certain things that you can do yourself. You can do some minor repairs, greasing wheels, oiling, changing oil. There's a fairly prescribed list in the regulations of what you can do yourself.
You probably wouldn't be allowed to touch the engine as far as dismantling and reassembly.
Technically, no. But that does happen under the watchful eye of a mechanic before everything gets closed back up again. It's sort of like if you do some electrical wiring in your house, you have to have the building inspector check it first, and that's sort of the same thing with an aircraft. Everything has to be signed off by the appropriate authorized inspector. Now, that doesn't hold true for experimental aircraft that a person builds themselves. If you build the aircraft at least 51% yourself, then you are the licensed mechanic for that particular airplane. Not one just like it that somebody else built, but the one that you built. Then you are the mechanic and you are the authorized person to do the annual inspections and do any maintenance and any repairs. That's in the experimental category. My airplane is not in the experimental category. It's a regular certified aircraft, so that falls under different qualifications. After we bought the airplane and kept it out here, I really don't fly a great deal. I try to fly often, but as slow as my airplane flies, sometimes I get a lot of time and don't go very far. You know, it cruises anywhere from 90 to 100 miles an hour, depending on the winds and that sort of thing. And Mary and I mostly use it for just going up and making holes in the sky. There's no particular destination. I have some other retired friends that Tom Schaefer has a Champ, a Ronca Champ in the hangar next to mine, and Jim Bacher has a Starduster that he built. And the three of us get together in the summertime, try at least once a week to fly someplace for lunch. You know, we go to Prairie du Chien or Cassville or Tama or Davenport or Muscatine, wherever. And we just, and we're kind of throwbacks to the 40s and 50s and early 60s, I think, of just flying for the pleasure of flying. We're not trying to make fast time or great destinations, but just go out and enjoy being in the air.
What was the greatest distance you ever flew at one time?
I would guess going into Addison Airport at Dallas, in the Dallas area. When I was in Cloud 9 Flying Club and we had a 4-place airplane, my wife and I and our 3 children would fly down there and visit her sister and her husband and their family. So we made the trip to Dallas 2 or 3 times. At one time, Mary and I owned a 4-place airplane by ourselves. This was before I bought the Taylorcraft. We had a Cessna 170, which was a 4-place airplane. And Mary and I flew this to Grand Forks, North Dakota. That's the greatest distance I flew it. We only owned it a couple of years when, and then I sold it. And an interesting story, I had heard that airplane went to Alaska. Well, we have some friends that live in Alaska, and we were up there 2 years or so ago, and I drove around, looked at some of the small airports around, and just in the last 2 months went on the internet and found one of the operators in Alaska, and I wrote to them and I told them who I was and that I used to own this 1950 Cessna 170, and I heard it went to Alaska, and somebody in Girdwood, Alaska was classified as the owner of that aircraft. I just wondered if you knew who it was. And I got an email back from this woman and said, "That's my baby, I own it, and so you're the previous owner," you know. And then she sent me 3 pictures of it and how they use it for flying up in the mountains, landing on the glaciers, and great sightseeing and so on. I'll tell you a story. Pilots sometimes make mistakes or do things that are maybe a little unsafe. I'll share with you the greatest near situation, the near accident that we might have had. Nothing happened, but on one of our trips to Dallas, my wife and I and the 3 kids, we were coming home from Dallas, and this was in the 70s when the gas crisis was on, and I had planned some gas stops on the way home, and each of a couple of places that we had stopped, they didn't have fuel, which the first place wasn't and gas at those airports, and so the last place that I had stopped that didn't have gas, they said, well, the closest gas would be Kirksville, Missouri. And so I got out and crawled up on the tire of the airplanes and measured how much gas with this very ruler. I had this in the baggage compartment of the aircraft, and I dropped this down in the gas tank to see how much gas was left, and I calculated by the amount that was left versus the amount of the capacity that we had enough to make it to Kirksville, which we did. But I had radioed in, we were doing a straight-in approach, and I kind of nudged my wife as we were coming in on final that when we get over that barn, she could stop praying, and she had been. It was a kind of a traumatic moment there, but I filled up with gas and put about 53 gallons in a 55-gallon total capacity. So that was too close for comfort.
Did you ever have a plan formulated in your head for just such an event, if you had to make an emergency landing, as to how much strip you would need to set it down in? This ever crossed through your head? I'm sure it did.
Yeah, and that's part of the training that you go through when you're getting your license. Is the instructor might just reach over and pull the throttle back and say, "Okay, forced landing," you know. And so one of the things that you're taught to do is always be on the alert for a place that you could use as a potential landing site. May not, you know, may not be the best, but if you can get it down. The criteria, of course, is to get down safely. Don't worry if you have to damage the airplane a little bit, but do as much as you can to protect the occupants. You know.
How much time would you have to make up your mind what would be a suitable place to put it down?
Of course, that depends on the altitude that you're flying. With the Taylor craft that I fly now, I don't fly very high. You know, I usually fly 1,000 feet, 700 feet, maybe 1,500 feet. So you don't. While it's got a fairly good glide ratio, you got. You know, you need to make a decision fairly fast of what your landing spot's going to be, and then stick with that, and not change your mind at the last minute. You know, stick with a spot. And like this airplane, if I've got 800 feet, I can get the airplane down, you know, assuming that there's no obstacles at the end of the runway and that sort of thing. So, because I learned to fly off Dad's Field, which is 1,700 feet, I've landed this airplane in strong winds where I could have landed it in a football field, you know, but that's with a strong headwind coming in. My interest today is not only in flying the Taylor craft and the camaraderie that goes with being around other people who are interested in aircraft, particularly old aircraft. That's my primary interest. But I'm also interested in the history of and trying to keep up with the aviation activities that are historical for around the Cedar Rapids area. You know, I can remember as a kid, as I drive by little farm fields and stuff, I can remember when there used to be a hangar there, or somebody had a private strip there. And as I drive into Urbana, or if I drive into Anamosa, or going to Central City, I know there are places where I've landed, you know, with my dad or by myself, that used to have a little airport, and they're no longer in existence, just like my dad's field. But today, my interest, in addition to occasional flying, is primarily in collecting things that have to do with history of this area. And I'm trying to, and I think I got a good start from that, because after Dad died, he had lots of stuff that he had saved, and I have all that memorabilia, lots of pictures, lots of old books and magazines and things that I grew up with, that I was able to do. And I read a lot of aviation stuff, and here in my closet, my aviation closet, I have a lot of memorabilia to that, and enjoy reading about that, keeping my collection going. I even go on eBay and I buy some old stuff off of eBay, and so that is the area of my primary interest now. And of course, this project with the History Center was right up my alley, because I knew a lot of the old timers around, and just like the first presentation I did over at the old Cedar Rapids History Center back in '94. I had a display and demonstration over there one Sunday, and a lot of old timers came, and a lot of people that we're working with on our current project were there. But the people who were the active pilots back in the 40s, maybe even the 30s, 40s, 50s, those people are disappearing fast. And so it's critical, as in any hobby or any interest area, that you do what documenting you can now while those people are still available to give you their insights and their recollections, and get that recorded. Model of a Ford Tri-Motor that Hurdle company up at Dyersville put out, and interestingly enough, they called me, the photographer called me from French studio, and had heard I had a lot of old aviation stuff and wanted to know if they could use some of it for the props for the cover. And so this is my father's original logbook and his wings from his days in the Civil Air Patrol that they used here on the cover. And then there's some old aircraft instruments and radios and so on that I have that they used in the background. But a guy called me the other day, and he said that he had heard that the History Center was doing this project, and somebody had contacted him and wanted to know if he had any old history. And so this guy called me and said, do you know about this project? And I said, well, yes, I was working with it. And he said, well, I didn't know anybody in town that had more old stuff about aircraft of this era than you did. So I said, yeah, I think it's probably with the project everybody's working on, it's going well. Yeah.
Carl, this has been a very enjoyable interview. Before we wrap it up, could we meet your wife and then find out what both of you have done throughout your lifetime in the Cedar Rapids area?
Oh, absolutely. Mary? This is my wife, Mary Carson, and she's been my my supporter in learning to fly and pursuing my aviation interests. Yeah.
Did you were you very enthusiastic about this?
Well, I'm more on the cautious side, but I knew it was real important to him, so I think I was more supportive than enthusiastic.
She doesn't hesitate to go flying with me, though, anytime she has the opportunity.
Yeah.
Did you ever have many occasions where you thought prayer may be the correct thing to do at the present?
I can remember a few.
Well,
Yes.
Tell us, Carl, what you did throughout your life here in Cedar Rapids, Linn County.
Yes, I was a teacher, taught for 10 years in the Cedar Rapids system, and then went into administration and was a building principal, primarily in elementary schools for quite a few years. Altogether, spent 37 years in the Cedar Rapids system, and then I had 1 year of teaching before I came to Cedar Rapids. Yes. And Mary, you did the same?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I had a few less years than he did, because we had some children. I stayed home the first few years, but we both retired from Cedar Rapids schools.
What schools did you teach at? Which particular schools?
You talking about me?
Yeah.
Well, we were both kind of all over the district, but my major thing was behavior disability, middle school, and special ed over the last 20 years or so.
Behavior disability. What did that involve?
Kids with severe behavior problems. We had an off-site program where we got the kids from the Cedar Rapids area that were not making it in the other junior highs or middle schools, and then they'd get referred to us. So we had the more difficult kids that were going through a rough adolescence. But it's the one disability you can recover from, so I always liked it.
Back then, in your younger years in doing this, did you ever think that things would come to where they are today as far as children with problems in school?
Well, I don't know. I guess that I think problems are serious, but I think kids have always had problems. And I think that they respond a lot to how you treat them. I know one thing related to flying is in the early days before you were we had such a mentality about suing and all this. One of the things that I could do to get kids to really behave was to get them on a contract to get an airplane ride with Carl. And I tell you, they thought that was big stuff. But, you know, kids are kids, and they really do the best they can do with what they're given, and some of them have some pretty rough situations to overcome, but they manage, and I always liked it.
Did you tell us what particular schools you worked at? Or?
Yes, I taught at Wilson Junior High at that time for 10 years, and then I was associate principal at Franklin, and then went into elementary administration, was principal at Harrison School, Tyler, Nixon, then worked at Metro High School for about 7 years, and then worked at the ESC for 5 years, and then reopened Jackson Elementary in 1993 and stayed there 3 years and retired in 1996.
So when you're in a large school district, you can have a lot of different experiences and never change employers.
Well, we want to thank you both very much, Mary. We want to thank Carl for the time he has given to the History Center, not only in serving on the Aviation Committee, but in giving us time to share with his dad and himself his memories. Thank you both very much from the History Center.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.